March 1943. Over the gray skies of northern France, the contrails of war twist into a deadly web. A formation of B-17 flying fortresses groans eastward, engines straining under the thin, freezing air. Their gunners scan the horizon. They know what's coming. From the sun above, dots appear. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s dive like hawks. In their radios, German voices joke about the new American escort fighter, Der Milchkuh, the milk cow, slow, fat, and easy to hit. Below, a lone silver shape rises to meet them, its radial engine roaring like thunder in a storm. The first German lines up his shot. But before he can fire, 8 blazing .50 caliber guns erupt from the American's wings. Tracers slice through the cold air, smashing into his fuselage. The Laughing stops. At 400 miles per hour, the clumsy Thunderbolt climbs past the falling wreck, leaving only smoke curling in the dawn. That day, the Luftwaffe learned a lesson. The bulk they mocked concealed a beast, one built to survive anything the Reich could throw at it. By early 1943, the skies above Europe had become a graveyard for bombers. Every mission that the U.S. 8th Air Force launched from England seemed to vanish into the gray distance, returning hours later with gaps in formation and engines trailing black smoke. Crews called it flying through hell. Daylight bombing. The American doctrine of precision strikes against factories and oil plants was proving suicidal. The Luftwaffe's fighter arm, the Jagdwaffe, dominated the skies from France to the Ruhr. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s hunted in disciplined packs, guided by radar and ground control. The British had tried similar missions in 1941 and 1942, and the losses forced them to abandon daylight raids altogether. But the Americans were determined to prove that precision bombing could cripple the Nazi war machine, if they could somehow survive the trip. The problem was range. Early escort fighters like the P-38 Lightning and P-39 era Cobra could not fly deep enough into occupied Europe. Bomber crews entered what they grimly called the Black Zone, the region beyond fighter cover, where German interceptors waited. From bases near Lille, Saint-Omer, and Bremen, they rose in coordinated waves, and one by one, American bombers fell. In August 1943, the infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission revealed just how vulnerable the U.S. Air Force was. Of 376 bombers sent, 60 were lost in a single day. Nearly 600 airmen never came home. The industrial targets were hit, but the price was catastrophic. Airmen began to doubt whether daylight bombing could continue at all. Meanwhile, the Germans were confident. From Channel Coast to Berlin, their radar nets tracked every formation hours before it arrived. Experienced aces like Walter Ussow, Egon Mayer, and Adolf Galland coordinated devastating interception tactics. Their fighters used head-on attacks, a terrifying innovation, diving directly at the bombers, firing, then peeling away at the last instant. The Allies had radar, discipline, and courage, but they lacked one essential weapon: a fighter that could climb fast, dive faster, and still fight after escorting bombers hundreds of miles from base. The Republic Aviation Company in New York believed they could build it, though few others did. At the time, most American fighters were sleek, light machines, agile, quick, and built for dogfighting. Republic's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, had another vision entirely. He imagined a Brute, a plane that could carry massive firepower, a huge engine, and enough armor to protect its pilot in the fiercest fight. In 1941, his idea took shape in the form of the XP-47B prototype. When test pilot Lowry Brabham first saw it, he reportedly asked if it could even fly. It weighed nearly 10,000 pounds, half again as much as most fighters of its day. But when the massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine ignited, the sound shook the airfield. At full power, it could climb like a rocket and dive faster than anything in the sky. Still, the U.S. Army Air Forces were hesitant. It was enormous. It burned fuel like a bomber, and with its turbo-supercharger system routed through long ducts and vents in the fuselage, it looked ungainly and over-engineered. Even American pilots laughed at it. But as 1943 bled on, laughter was a luxury few could afford. The bombers needed protection, and the P-47, nicknamed Thunderbolt, was available in growing numbers. By the summer of 1943, the first operational squadrons of P-47s, the 56th Fighter Group, under Colonel Hubert Zemke, arrived in England. Zemke, a disciplined tactician and aggressive leader, immediately saw the potential in the machine everyone else dismissed. He drilled his pilots to use its strengths: altitude, dive speed, and firepower. Because if the P-47 couldn't turn like a Spitfire, it could outdive and outshoot anything the Luftwaffe had. The war in the air was about to change, but not yet. For now, every mission over Germany still carried the same bitter truth. The bombers were bait, and the Luftwaffe still ruled the sky. And in that storm of attrition, the legend of the Jug, the indestructible Thunderbolt, was just beginning to take shape. While Europe burned under the roar of Luftwaffe engines, in Farmingdale, Long Island, a group of American engineers were fighting a quieter, but no less crucial, battle. The battle to build a fighter that could survive the skies of 1943. The Republic Aviation Plant pulsed day and night. Welders, draftsmen, and test crews worked under blackout curtains, assembling a machine unlike any that had flown before. Its official designation was P-47C, but, to those who built it, it was a brute of metal and muscle. At the heart of it sat the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine capable of more than 2,000 horsepower. No liquid cooling, no fragile radiators. A radial engine could take hits, leak oil, and still bring its pilot home. The engineers coupled it to a General Electric turbo supercharger, a marvel of American industry that forced air into the cylinders even at high altitude. It gave the Thunderbolt its roar, a deep, rolling thunder that earned it its name. But the design came at a cost. The turbo supercharger required long ducts running through the belly of the fuselage, and the heavy engine demanded a massive airframe to balance it. The result was a fighter that weighed nearly twice as much as a Spitfire, and pilots joked it was built around an engine with wings added as an afterthought. When the first production models rolled out in late 1942, many in the Army Air Forces were skeptical. Test pilots found it slow to climb, sluggish at low altitude, and thirsty for fuel. Too heavy, they said. Too complicated. The Thunderbolt seemed to violate every rule of fighter design. Yet in flight, something extraordinary happened. Once airborne, the P-47 revealed a temperament that matched its bulk. Stable, powerful, and nearly indestructible. In dives, it could exceed 500 miles per hour, speeds that tore other fighters apart. Its 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns could fire a combined 100 rounds per second, shredding anything in their path. And when tested under fire, its rugged airframe absorbed punishment that would have killed other aircraft. For pilots, survival was everything. Word spread quickly through air bases. The Jug could take hits, belly land, and still taxi home. There were stories of planes returning with cylinders blown out, flaps gone, and holes big enough to crawl through. Yet the pilot climbed out alive. Still, reputation alone could not win a war. In the spring of 1943, the Thunderbolt began its combat debut over occupied France. The 4th and 56th Fighter Groups, operating out of bases in East Anglia, flew the first bomber escort missions in earnest. The Luftwaffe, quick to test any newcomer, pounced. German radio chatter was filled with laughter. They called it the 7-ton milk cow, a joke on its size and shape. But as those first encounters unfolded, the laughter began to fade. The P-47 might not climb like a Messerschmitt, but once it reached altitude, its performance was unmatched. It could dive away from danger at astonishing speed and re-engage with a burst of gunfire that left the enemy riddled and trailing smoke by late summer. American pilots were discovering tactics that played to the Thunderbolt's strengths. They learned to fight vertically, climbing above, diving down, and striking hard before the Germans could react. They called it boom and zoom. Against disciplined Luftwaffe formations, it was devastating. Then came the introduction of drop tanks, a simple yet revolutionary idea. The Thunderbolt's fuel thirst had limited its range, but with external tanks slung beneath its wings, it could finally escort bombers deep into enemy territory. For the first time, American B-17s could reach into the heart of Germany and come back with fighter protection. By the end of 1943, the Luftwaffe began to sense a change in the rhythm of the war. The Americans were no longer turning back at the Rhine. They were coming for the factories at Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Kassel. And they were not coming alone. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once dismissed as too big and too slow, was now proving to be the hammer the Allies needed. And in the months to come, it would transform from a defensive escort into an instrument of relentless destruction. Not just in the air, but on the ground, where German convoys and armor columns would learn to fear its scream. The age of the juggernaut had begun, and with it, the tide of air superiority was slowly, inexorably, beginning to turn. The P-47 story was never just about metal and horsepower. It was about the men who climbed into it, young pilots who learned to trust a machine that looked like no other fighter in the sky. When the first Thunderbolts arrived in England, many pilots were disappointed. They had grown up hearing stories of Spitfires slicing through the Battle of Britain, of nimble P-40s dueling in North Africa. The P-47, by comparison, looked like a barrel with wings. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group was among those early skeptics. In his first combat flight, his guns jammed and his fuel tank failed to drop. He barely made it back across the channel. But weeks later, after surviving a head-on attack from a Focke-Wulf 190 that riddled his plane with over 20 hits, he limped home. The engine still running, controls shredded, canopy fused shut. He had to land with his head outside the cockpit window just to see. When ground crews counted the bullet holes, more than 200, and realized the aircraft had still flown, Johnson's opinion changed forever. He later called the P-47 a fighter pilot's dream, if you knew how to fly it right. The pilots of the 56th, men like Francis Gabby Gabreski, Zemke, and Johnson, became legends of the European air war. They learned that the Jug wasn't a dancer, it was a brawler. It didn't win by elegance, it won by endurance, speed, and sheer firepower. These were young men, many in their early 20s, flying hundreds of miles from home in skies thick with flak and fighters. For them, the P-47 became a kind of armor, not just of steel, but of confidence. When a pilot strapped into the Thunderbolt, he knew that if he was hit, there was still a good chance he'd see another sunrise. The Thunderbolt's power was rooted in one of the most advanced engines of its time, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. This 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial was a masterpiece of American engineering, also used in the F-6F Hellcat, and later the F-4U Corsair. But in the P-47, its potential was amplified by the General Electric Turbo Supercharger, a system that turned high-altitude performance into unmatched dominance. While other fighters lost power in the thin air above 25,000 feet, the Thunderbolt's turbocharger forced oxygen back into the engine, keeping its power curve steady. It was a secret weapon in plain sight. In combat, German pilots often tried to climb away from the fight, counting on thinner air to rob American engines of strength. But the P-47 could follow them up and keep firing. Each of its 8 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns could fire 800 rounds per minute. Together, they unleashed more than 100 rounds every second, heavy enough to tear through armor, bombers, and fighters alike. At full power, the recoil shook the aircraft, tracers streaking out like molten rain. Luftwaffe pilots, who once laughed at its bulk, soon learned that one short burst could shred a Messerschmitt's tail clean off. And beneath its tough skin, the Thunderbolt systems were a triumph of redundancy. Armor plates wrapped around the cockpit. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the risk of fire. A heavy, wide landing gear absorbed punishment from rough airstrips. Even if the hydraulics failed, pilots could use manual control to get home. In short, the P-47 was built not to outturn the enemy, but to outlast him. Tactics transformed the Thunderbolt from an underdog to a legend. Colonel Hub Zemke and his squadron commanders redefined how their men fought. Instead of tight-turning battles, they adopted energy tactics: climb high, dive fast, strike once, escape. The Jug's greatest weapon was gravity. From 30,000 feet, a diving Thunderbolt could exceed 500 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter. At that speed, even the Luftwaffe's best couldn't follow. Zemke drilled his men relentlessly. Never turn with them, hit once and climb. This method, boom and zoom, became the hallmark of Thunderbolt combat. The Luftwaffe's aces soon discovered that trying to chase a diving P-47 was suicide. Its momentum and firepower made it lethal in surprise attacks. By late 1943, American formations of Thunderbolts had learned to fly loose, giving each pilot space to maneuver and dive at will. They hunted in altitude stacks, one flight high, another lower, covering each other in rolling attacks. The results were devastating. In one mission alone, the 56th Fighter Group claimed over 25 enemy aircraft without a single loss. And when drop tanks extended their range, the Thunderbolt's reach grew. Now they could escort bombers to the edge of Berlin and back. The Germans, once comfortable ambushing bombers without fear of escort, suddenly found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and constantly pursued. But for all its high-altitude glory, the Jug's evolution was not complete. The true transformation from escort fighter to unstoppable ground attack machine was yet to come. And when it did, it would forever cement the Thunderbolt's place as one of the most feared aircraft of the war. For the Luftwaffe, arrogance had long been armor. Their aces ruled the skies over Europe since 1939, from the battles above Poland and France to the dying embers of the Blitz. By 1943, many German fighter pilots saw the Americans as brave but inexperienced. They had faced slow bombers, not seasoned killers in armored giants. At first glance, the P-47 seemed to confirm their confidence. It was massive, larger even than some twin-engine aircraft. German pilots joked it was a flying barrel or a cow with wings. They believed it couldn't turn or climb fast enough to pose a threat. But arrogance is a fragile defense. As the months passed, reports began to filter back to Luftwaffe command. Pilots who engaged the new American fighter often did not return. Those who did told uneasy stories. The Thunderbolt dove like a falling anvil, its guns bright as lightning, its frame seemingly immune to damage. An FW-190 pilot named Heinz Negus Marquardt later recalled, "You could shoot it, and it would keep flying. You could not kill it fast enough." The change in tone was unmistakable. By early 1944, Luftwaffe pilots no longer joked about the P-47. They called it der Donnerbolzen, the Thunderbolt, with reluctant respect. They began adjusting tactics, preferring head-on passes or disengaging entirely rather than risk a turning fight. Even the most confident German aces learned to watch their altitude, for they never knew when a silver shape might appear out of the sun, diving with terrifying speed. The psychological effect was immense. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of the skies, was now fighting to survive every encounter, and that fear began to spread down the chain of command, from squadron leaders to green pilots barely trained before being thrown into battle. Behind every machine that changed the war, there was a leader who understood how to wield it. For the P-47, that man was Colonel Hub Zemke. A calm, analytical officer from Montana, Zemke had studied the Luftwaffe long before he met them in combat. He understood their discipline, their altitude tactics, and their dependence on teamwork. And he built the 56th Fighter Group into a counterforce to match them. Zemke's men called themselves Zemke's Wolf Pack. It wasn't bravado, it was doctrine. They hunted in coordinated teams, always maintaining altitude advantage and communication. Each pilot knew his partner's position, his escape vector, his role in the kill chain. Zemke taught his men that survival came from aggression, not defense. Always be the hunter, he said. Never the prey. He banned unnecessary chatter on the radio. He pushed his pilots to master the aircraft's dive recovery, power management, and energy retention. Under his command, the Wolfpack became the deadliest fighter group in the 8th Air Force. By the end of the war, they would claim over 665 aerial victories, the highest of any P-47 unit in history. Zemke himself became one of the most respected tacticians of the air war, a man who proved that strategy and psychology could be as decisive as engine power or ammunition. Beyond Zemke, other leaders followed his model. Colonel David Schilling, Francis Gabreski, and Robert Johnson led by example, racking up victories while teaching their men that patience and altitude were their greatest weapons. They turned the P-47 from a misunderstood giant into a precision instrument of air dominance. By 1944, the P-47 was no longer just a guardian of bombers. It was an executioner of the Luftwaffe. But the war demanded more. As the Allies prepared for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, air superiority was only half the equation. They also needed to destroy Germany's capacity to fight on the ground. Trains, tanks, convoys, and fuel depots. The Thunderbolt was uniquely suited for this brutal new phase. Its toughness and heavy payload allowed it to carry bombs, rockets, and drop tanks simultaneously. It could dive on armored columns, release its ordnance, and pull out even under flak fire that shredded lighter aircraft. Under General James Doolittle's command, the USAAF shifted strategy, giving fighter pilots freedom to engage the enemy at will, not just stay glued to bomber formations. This unleashed chaos for the Luftwaffe. P-47s now prowled German airfields, strafing runways and destroying aircraft before they could even take off. They struck supply lines from France to Poland, cutting off vital resources. Each week, the Luftwaffe lost not only machines, but fuel, the lifeblood of flight. By mid-1944, Germany's skies were filled with burning wreckage. The Thunderbolt's presence ensured that even when the P-51 Mustang took over as long-range escort, the P-47 remained the hammer of tactical destruction. Its combination of range, armor, and firepower made it one of the few planes that could both dogfight at 30,000 feet and pulverize tanks at 500. German troops began to dread the distinct howl of its dive, the thunderclap of machine, guns and rockets raining from above. In the hedgerows of Normandy, soldiers whispered of the Jabos, fighter bombers that turned retreating columns into wreckage. And from that chaos, the Thunderbolt's reputation was sealed. It was no longer the fighter the Germans laughed at. It was the storm they feared. The laughter had turned to silence. The sky itself had changed hands. Winter 1943 bled into 1944 under a sky of smoke. For the Allied airmen stationed across England, every dawn began the same way. A briefing room heavy with cigarette haze, a map filled with red lines stretching deep into Germany, and the silent calculation of who might not return. But now, the odds were changing. The P-47 Thunderbolt had matured from an awkward newcomer into the backbone of the 8th Air Force's fighter command. Its pilots were confident, its tactics refined, and its firepower unmatched. The Luftwaffe still dominated the heartland of Germany, but cracks were beginning to show. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and the unrelenting tempo of American raids. January 1944. The strategic bombing campaign reached full fury. Massed formations of B-17s and B-24s thundered toward industrial cities like Brunswick, Frankfurt, and Schweinfurt. Above and around them flew the Silver Guardians, squadrons of P-47s, engines roaring, wings loaded with ammunition. For the first time, the Luftwaffe found itself hunted even before it could climb to intercept. In previous months, the bombers had been easy prey once they crossed into Germany. But now, the Thunderbolts went looking for the hunters. Colonel Zemke's Wolf Pack pioneered fighter sweeps, aggressive patrols launched ahead of the bombers, scouring the skies and attacking Luftwaffe airfields directly. It was the first time the Germans faced a true offensive in their own airspace. Suddenly, their air bases were under siege. Fuel trucks exploded. Hangars burned. The war was shifting from defense to annihilation. Over Brunswick, February 10, 1944, the transformation became undeniable. P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group met a swarm of Bf-109s head-on. The Germans dove in tight formation, expecting the same easy kills they'd earned a year before. Instead, the sky erupted in converging trails of fire. 8 50-caliber guns per plane, more than 250 barrels in total, ripped through the formation. When it was over, more than a dozen Luftwaffe fighters lay burning across the fields below. The Americans lost only 2 aircraft, both pilots rescued. The mission reports told a simple story. Enemy broke contact. But in the hangars and mess halls that night, every pilot knew what it meant. The tide had turned. March brought Operation Argument, better known as Big Week. For 7 relentless days, from February 20 to 25, 1944, the U.S. 8th and 15th Air Forces pounded German aircraft factories at Leipzig, Regensburg, and Gotha. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the defense. Nearly 2,000 fighters scrambled in 5 days. But this time, the bombers were not alone. P-47s dove through flak and contrails, breaking up German formations before they could reach the bombers. Their radio chatter, calm, clipped, professional, became the rhythm of victory. Blue flight, break left. Red, cover high. Target clear. By the end of Big Week, Germany had lost over 350 aircraft in the air and hundreds more on the ground. Factories were crippled. Fuel depots in flames. The Luftwaffe's backbone was beginning to snap. The Thunderbolt's role was not just protection. It was transformation. In every combat zone, the message was the same. The Allies could now attack anywhere, anytime. What began as defensive escort missions evolved into an air offensive that reached into the heart of the Reich itself. April 1944. A clear day over central Germany. A formation of B-17s heads for Berlin. High above, their escorts, P-47s and the new P-51 Mustangs, weave silently, scanning the horizon. Suddenly, radar warnings crackle in German control rooms. Feindverband über Magdeburg. Enemy formation over Magdeburg. But the interceptors never make it. Their runways are already cratered from an early morning Thunderbolt raid. For the men of the Luftwaffe, the realization was devastating. The war in the air, once their domain, had turned against them completely. Every sortie meant facing opponents who could now match or exceed them in speed, altitude, and endurance. Every climb into the sky felt like a gamble against death. The Thunderbolt became more than a weapon. It was a signal, proof that American industry and innovation could overcome the Luftwaffe's years of experience and tactical advantage. Factories in the U.S. were producing hundreds of aircraft a month, engines roaring off the assembly line, each one an industrial promise that the skies of Europe would never again belong to Hitler's Reich. By May 1944, Allied air superiority was no longer a goal. It was a reality. The P-47s, now equipped with 150-gallon drop tanks, escorted bombers all the way to Berlin and back. They roamed the skies freely, strafing locomotives, convoys, and troop trains from dawn till dusk. Even as the P-51 Mustang began to take over deep escort duties, the Thunderbolt remained the workhorse of destruction, the iron fist of the Allied air war. And as the sun set over English airfields, the returning formations of silver jugs gleamed like polished armor, engines cooling, gun barrels blackened from battle. They had done what few thought possible only a year before. They had broken the Luftwaffe's hold on Europe. But the Thunderbolt's greatest purpose was still ahead. The invasion of Normandy was coming, and the skies would decide whether it succeeded or failed. The P-47 would now descend from the heavens to wage war at treetop level, where its thunder would be felt not just by pilots, but by every German soldier on the ground. June 6, 1944. Before dawn broke over the English Channel, 5,000 ships moved through the fog toward Normandy. Above them, the sky vibrated with the roar of engines, an endless river of Allied aircraft streaming east. Among them flew the unmistakable silhouettes of the P-47 Thunderbolt. Once built for the high-sky duels of Germany, the Jug was now about to become something else entirely: the hammer of D-Day. At 3,000 feet, Thunderbolts of the 56th and 78th Fighter Groups swept in ahead of the invasion fleet. Their mission: silence the coastal guns, shred the enemy's transport columns, and keep the skies clear. The first shells from the naval bombardment flashed below as the fighters broke formation and dove toward the beaches. Within minutes, rail lines were cut, convoys erupted in fire, and German communications vanished in smoke. By sunrise, the Thunderbolt owned the low sky. Every road leading into Normandy became a death trap for German reinforcements. The P-47's 850 caliber guns tore through trucks, tanks, and even concrete bunkers. Its rugged airframe, thick armor, self-sealing fuel tanks let it survive hits that would have destroyed any other plane. Pilots returned with wings full of holes, engines coughing, canopies cracked. But they came back. The Jug had earned its name once more. As paratroopers fought in the hedgerows below, Thunderbolts flew almost continuously, sometimes 8 sorties a day. They bombed bridges, strafed troop trains, and obliterated armored columns that tried to counterattack near Caen and Saint-Lô. The radio chatter was terse, efficient. Blue flight. Target convoy on road south of Vire. Let's roll in. Seconds later, the countryside erupted in dust and flame. German soldiers began to fear the growl of that radial engine long before they saw it. They called it the Butcher Bird of Normandy. Even tank crews, hardened veterans from the Eastern Front, learned that a single hit from a Thunderbolt's rockets could rip open a Panther like a tin can. It wasn't just firepower. It was presence. The constant scream of Thunderbolts overhead meant the Allies were everywhere. Day and night. The sky itself belonged to them. July 1944. The breakout from Normandy began. When General Patton's Third Army punched through German lines, the P-47s were his spear point in the air. They cleared roads, smashed retreating columns, and strafed rail yards from Brittany to the Loire. Every movement of Patton's tanks was shadowed by thunderbolts, a symphony of steel and wings, perfectly synchronized. Ground troops learned to cheer when they heard that low, rumbling roar. They knew help was coming. By August, the Germans were in full retreat. Highways were littered with wreckage. The infamous Falaise Pocket became a graveyard of twisted armor and shattered vehicles. Historians would later call it the Corridor of Death. To the pilots of the Thunderbolt, it was simply another day's work. They flew until their ammunition ran dry, then returned to rearm and take off again. By nightfall, nothing moved on those roads but smoke. As the Allies advanced through France, the Thunderbolt's mission followed them. Deeper, faster, lower. The war that had begun in the stratosphere now burned just above the treetops. Pilots had seconds to spot a target, aim, and fire. Mistakes were fatal. But their skill grew with every sortie. They became flying artillery, the precise, relentless arm of Allied strategy. By the autumn of 1944, the Thunderbolt had become the most feared ground attack aircraft in Europe. Its kill tallies were staggering. Thousands of vehicles, locomotives, bridges, and tanks destroyed. But its greatest achievement was invisible. It shattered the enemy's ability to move. German troops could no longer reinforce, resupply, or retreat in daylight. Every column had to wait for night. Every truck needed camouflage. Every movement was a risk of fiery death from above. The winter of 1944 brought new challenges. The German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, erupted under low clouds and freezing fog. For days, Allied air power was grounded. Thunderbolt pilots waited, engines idling, listening to the distant thunder of artillery from the front. Then, on December 23rd, the weather broke. When the clouds lifted, the P-47s poured into the sky like avenging angels. They hunted anything that moved. Convoys, tanks, even horse-drawn carts. All were caught in the open as the Thunderbolts descended. In those crucial days, they destroyed over 10,000 vehicles and crippled the German offensive. Patton later said simply, "The Air Force saved the Army." By early 1945, the Thunderbolt had followed the war across the Rhine. Now operating from captured airstrips inside Germany, it attacked not only the Wehrmacht's armor, but its soul, its cities, its railways, its last hopes of resistance. Pilots flew missions from dawn to dusk, some returning so exhausted they could barely climb out of their cockpits. Yet they flew again the next day. And when the last missions were flown, when Allied troops crossed the Rhine and the swastika fell from the Reichstag, the Thunderbolt was still there, oil-streaked, gun-scarred, and unbroken. The fighter that had begun as a high-altitude escort had ended as the symbol of total air supremacy. As victory approached, one pilot wrote in his logbook, "The Jug never quit. She took us there and she brought us home." When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Cities burned, armies shattered, skies finally quiet after 6 years of endless thunder. Among the countless machines that had carried that war across continents, one silhouette lingered. The thick-bodied fighter with 8 scars of fire under its wings. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had done more than fight. It had endured. Historians would call it a paradox. A brute that moved with precision. A heavyweight that danced among clouds. It had been mocked by its enemies and doubted by its own. Yet it became one of the deadliest and most reliable aircraft of the Second World War. Over 15,000 were built, more than any other American fighter. And in every major campaign of Europe, from the skies above the Channel to the plains of Germany, the Thunderbolt was there. Its legacy wasn't only in victories, but in survival. Tens of thousands of pilots came home because their aircraft could take punishment and still fly. They remembered the smell of oil and cordite, the thunder of 8 Brownings, the deep hum of that massive radial engine. They remembered what it felt like to be hit, to see the fuel gauge drop, and still find themselves alive minutes later because the jug refused to die. In the years that followed, the jet age arrived, sleek and silver, promising speed beyond imagination. But even as the new swept away the old, the lessons of the P-47 endured. It taught engineers that power and protection were as vital as agility, that survivability was as heroic as speed. It proved that a fighter could be both sword and shield, and for the men who flew her, the memory never faded. In air shows decades later, when a restored Thunderbolt rumbled to life and lifted off once more, veterans would fall silent, watching that familiar silhouette climb into the blue. For a moment, they were young again, hearing the sound of freedom over Europe. The P-47 Thunderbolt was more than a machine. It was a promise that strength, courage, and resilience could turn laughter into fear and defeat into victory. It was the roar that broke the Reich's back, and the thunder that still echoes through history.